Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and Dr. Taylor for giving the background about my involvement with those seminars. It is my pleasure to participate in this really interesting series. So today we are going to hear about lacquer from places which are lesser known, from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. As Dr. Taylor mentioned, this is a pre-recorded presentation, so I'm here to answer questions after our webinar is concluded. So again, thank you very much, and I guess we are going to watch and listen to the presentation.
Hello, I'm Hanna Szczepanowska, and I welcome you all to the webinar on lacquer in Southeast Asia. For centuries, lacquer has been used for utilitarian, decorative and ceremonial objects throughout Southeast Asia. The Japanese colleagues, I'm sure, are familiar with lacquer art and lacquerware because lacquer craft is considered a national treasure. It has been practiced, celebrated, and respected for centuries. Similarly, China also considers lacquer an important traditional material. The exquisite Japanese inro box, which you can see on the right, illustrates the craftsmanship of Japanese lacquer artisans. The other image, which you see on the left, shows lacquer applied over stingray skin, a traditional combination of rather unusual materials, which I'll explore later about application of lacquer over stingray. Today's presentation is exploring lacquer traditions in other places in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Although the tradition of lacquerware production and use in those countries goes back hundreds of years, it is rapidly declining, and that was one of my personal motivations to capture as much as possible of what is left from the tradition when I was working in Southeast Asia in 2015 and 2019. As a material scientist who analyzes museum objects from a material point of view, I explore the context of the studied objects. Therefore, today we will visit workshops in those three countries which I mentioned earlier, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar, to understand how lacquer, the material, is worked with and applied. What types of lacquer are used in the region and how the raw lacquer is harvested, because some of the harvesting techniques impact the behavior of lacquer, especially its color. And finally, we will look how the practical knowledge assists in interpretation of chemical analysis. The image in the background, by the way, shows a lacquer serving plate which was crafted in a family-run workshop in Inle Lake in Myanmar, which I visited in 2017 and 2018. We will visit that later during this presentation. The places which I visited, collected samples from forests and workshops, are marked on this map. And by the way, the size of the red dots is intentionally uneven. It corresponds to the footprint of lacquer presence and operation in those areas. So the largest presence of lacquer I found in Bagan, which is also referred by its old name, Pagan. There is a technical school where lacquer techniques are being taught. A large accumulation of lacquer workshops in the old part of Bagan displayed a diverse decorative techniques which are still being practiced by different artists. In addition to Bagan, I visited the family lacquer workshop, which I mentioned just a moment ago, run by 5 sisters on Inle Lake, and collected samples from the forest near Kaku, which is north part from Inle Lake. The second place, considering the use of lacquer, meaning the number of working workshops, was Vietnam. Lacquer tradition is associated with artistic expressions, and lacquer is used as an artistic medium. And some of the examples of lacquer painting we will see later in today's presentation. In Vietnam, I visited 2 artist studios, one in Hanoi and one in Hoi An, which is more in the center of the country. I collected samples of raw latex from the north part of Vietnam in the forest, which is approximately 60 kilometers north from Hanoi. And that lacquer, by the way, is also being used in Laos and transported to different places around Vietnam. So it is a very important center of lacquer extraction. In Cambodia, there is one only lacquer artist who, by the way, is of French origin and runs a gallery and a training center for local artisans. His creations, however, cannot be considered as typical for Cambodia and for region in the country, because he embraces different techniques and different styles, which are somehow a combination of different styles from the region. As I mentioned earlier, the decline of lacquer tradition in the region was one of my personal motivation factors to explore the traditions which are still left in the region. So what are the reasons behind the mise of lacquer processing and extraction? Well, one of them is a great physical difficulty to harvest lacquer. As you can see on the right, the lacquer harvester is climbing the tree, and access to those trees is also not easy. Often one has to go through the water to actually reach the region where lacquer is collected. That image is from Cambodia, near Siem Reap. So lacquer is also toxic as a material and causes allergies. And that's another obstacle, the need to handle it carefully. And finally, there is no incentive in most places to support lacquer harvesting and processing. And one exception is Thailand, where lacquer traditions are supported by the royal family. They organize international conferences every few years and subsidize the attendance. In Japan and China, because the tradition of using lacquer is centuries old, lacquer is studied in a systematic way, and not the same can be said about other Southeast Asia countries. Traditional use, however, of lacquer is similar in all those places in the region. Lacquer is used as surface finishing coating on ceremonial vessels, as a decorative element, often combined with gold, as you can see here on objects of veneration, such as the sculpture of Buddha. It is also used in daily objects like waterproofing boats or large baskets. So in these applications, we can trace additives which reveal the purpose of the object and its geographical location. Lacquer has been celebrated because of its exquisite aesthetic qualities, its hard and resilient surface, and in some cases it claims to have also health benefits. So examples of objects here show the diverse application of lacquer within one group of high quality objects. Here's an example of a veneration statue of Buddha on the right side, where lacquer was applied as base on which gold leaf was attached later. In the center you can see a ceremonial, on the left and in the center you can see a ceremonial container which shows rich ornamentation, and finally in a small box in the center where lacquer was combined with mother of pearl and ivory. This betel box represents a typical lacquerware of everyday use. And how do we know actually that it is from Myanmar? The pattern of decoration gives us a clue as to the region where it was produced, because each region has a distinct way of decorating their lacquerware. In fact, several publications were already issued on that subject. Betel, by the way, refers to a nut which has been traditionally chewed during social gatherings, and that tradition also is slowly declining, and consequently the need for production of betel wax. So what you see on the right is a close-up, which was of an image taken under higher magnification to show the intricate design and carving process and how the paint was applied into those carved areas. So returning for a moment, our first image where lacquer was applied on over stingray skin. The concept has its own tradition, and typically in the past it was used as cover of handles of swords and scabbards to overcome the slipperiness, to basically increase the surface and attachment to the surface. It is called shagreen, although the definition of shagreen in fact refers to shark skin, which was used as decorative material, or sometimes refers to just naturally rough surface with scales or granulated pattern. Japanese tachi, katana, and wakizashi swords had their hilts almost always covered with undyed shagreen. And by the way, on the top right corner you can see a stingray fish from which the skin is used as a decorative component in application with lacquer. And here are the lacquer paintings, meaning that lacquer was the main artistic medium. Creation of a lacquer painting is based on reduction rather than addition of layers, as it is done traditionally in all paintings in the West. So on the left is an artwork of a Japanese artist who works in Hoi An in Vietnam. And that artwork is part of my collection, so I have a chance to examine in detail intricate design and different materials which are incorporated into that painting. It shows a very rich array of artistic expressions, which is just exemplified in one piece. On the right side, you can see a very different expression in which lacquer also was used as a main media. So what is lacquer? It is a latex which is extracted from trees. Upon extraction, when just leaving the tree, it is of milky white color, which quickly changes upon exposure to air. It undergoes oxidation and polymerization, as you can see at the very right, where lacquer, which is still slightly showing that off-white discoloration of natural lacquer, first turns into orange a substance and next turns into black, which is typical color of raw lacquer. So from the left, what you see are fruits and seeds of Gluta lucifera tree in Cambodia. And I was fortunate to see that tree in bloom. You can see me in the center. That is one of the trees which had to be reached by water. There was actually a walk of several miles through the water rice fields to reach those lacquer trees. There is actually no pattern when the tree blooms. That's why it is quite difficult to find a time to observe that magnificent bloom of lacquer trees. Part of my field investigation was to trace the methods of how lacquer was harvested in each country, because the methods of extracting the lacquer, materials used in making the tools, and how lacquer is stored are all factors which I recorded when traversing the region, because they have impact on how lacquer is behaving later, how it is drying, and how it is handled. So starting with Cambodia, where I encountered the largest and oldest tree, and their age was estimated to be over 8 years old. The collection was carried out by one man, whom you see in the center, the main image, he was in his 70s and still climbing the trees. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2019. So I was fortunate to have a chance to meet him and observe his methods of extracting the lacquer. So The short bamboo vessel is inserted into chevron-shaped incision, and I marked with the yellow circle or oval where that incision and attachment of bamboo vessel is present. And there are many areas on the tree where lacquer is collected in the bamboo vessel. On the right, you can see a tool which was used by the harvester with two sharp edges on both sides, and that is used just to cut that chevron-shaped incision, which you can see at the very bottom. Harvesting lacquer in Myanmar was similar, but also had quite distinct regional characteristics. That illustrates harvesting near Kaku village, which I mentioned is like approximately an hour drive north from Inle Lake. Again, it shows insertion of a bamboo vessel, which you can see on the very right at the bottom, which is collected usually every several days. However, incisions themselves don't show any particular pattern. As you can see in two central images, the bark is pretty much scorned and lifted and separated from the main core of the tree. And as you can see very clearly, the revealed lacquer is off-white on the center small image and becomes dark when it goes through polymerization and when it's exposed to oxygen. And trees, as you can see on the left, are much smaller than the one which we had a chance to see in Cambodia. Harvest of lacquer in Vietnam, I observed in Po village, which is approximately 60 kilometers north from Hanoi. What is different about that particular location is that lacquer collectors harvest latex all year long. In fact, the whole plantation of lacquer trees was designed to supply lacquer for the whole region. So that is the sole purpose of that, actually, of that forest plantation in the forest. So looking more closely into practice of harvesting lacquer, although the bark cutting was carried out in a distinct chevron shape, which was similar to what we observed in Cambodia, the cuts were much deeper and invasive. After several years of extensive harvesting, the tree is left to grow and is not harvested any longer. The old scars are healing for a long time, and you can see the close-up on the left side. What is interesting and different from other places is the vessel where lacquer is collected. It is collected in a seashell. You can see on the right in the center image. Because lacquer, as I mentioned, is the main source of income for that particular community, it is gathered every day and is supplied in large quantities through the region. Lacquer as a material can be purchased on local markets in the regions where lacquer is traditionally harvested, like in Myanmar and Vietnam. One way to store it is in a small container in bamboo, as you can see on this image on the right side. Also, when I collected lacquer, I tried to collect them in tightly closed containers, glass vials, which you can see in the top center. They show the color of original lacquer, which is light beige off-white, which eventually turned into black completely through polymerization. So, looking at lacquer as a material, what factors I consider in analysis and which one I try to record later. So application is one of the factors which somehow dictates how lacquer is handled. Because what I mean by application is the purpose for which lacquer will be used. So if it's intended, for example, for daily use, such as caulking material for boats, it will not require a careful storing to extend its fluidity or slowing down the polymerization. For artistic purposes, on the other hand, it will undergo some minor processing on a simple level, such as, for example, separation of impurities. And here's an example of an application of lacquer in the form in which it was harvested. It's almost a crude lacquer. There are very few additives which are incorporated into a whole mass of lacquer. In this case, is organic solvent. You can see a small container on the top right, which is added to lacquer to extend its fluidity and workable state. So tools, which you also see on the right side, are also quite simple, and most likely they have not changed for centuries since lacquer was used. Simple bamboo applicator, which is used for mixing and also application onto surfaces. And that is a family-run workshop, and I'll show you in a moment the whole crew of 5 sisters who is running that workshop. One of very few which is left. And here they are, the group of 5 sisters who ran this workshop. As I mentioned, one of very few still in existence in around Inle Lake. And by the way, the work is carried out on the front porch, and you can see in front of us some of the serving display traces, which are frequently used in local temples. And the drying occurs in the back shed, which you can see is the background of our group. The drying is actually carried out literally above the surface of water, because drying is not really drying in our understanding. It is actually polymerization of lacquer, which requires almost 100% relative humidity. So it is carried out in a rather wet environment. And this is a much larger production complex, also in Myanmar, not far from Inle Lake, in the Bagan. As I mentioned earlier, Bagan is one of the most prominent centers where stages of production follow in sequence. It's also an important place where there are many different workshops, and each one has own decorative style and different sort of a bit of production style of objects. So the work is performed in sequence, creating a structure and then applying lacquer and decoration. What we see here in the center is the main hall where finishing touches are applied by a group of women workers. Men are typically involved in fabricating support structures. On the left is a contemporary vessel which I purchased in this workshop, and it's the representation of a traditional rice offering container. And you may recall from an earlier illustration of a betel box that's the typical intricate design that is characteristic for the Bagan region. It's carved into lacquer and paint is applied in stages. What I observed in that workshop in Bagan, which is shown on the left, a technique of plating small containers using bamboo strands and horse hair to make them more flexible, is also practiced in Cambodia. As you can see, the same method illustrated on the right slide. And that is the only place known in Cambodia where lacquer is actively collected and worked with, Siem Reap. The owner is not native Cambodian, but a Frenchman, a conservator, who originally was working at the Louvre and was sent on assignment to Cambodia to study lacquer, well, and stayed for 20 plus years. And so probably he also realized that lacquer craft is in the Mise. So he's culturing lacquer trees, working with lacquer harvest, lacquer which was harvested by this old man whom I featured earlier, and he's also creating art with lacquer. Some of the examples of his artworks and creations we can observe in his gallery, which is next to his workshop. And you can see here vessels which were created in a very similar way as they were created in the Myanmar. also combined with gold leaf, you can see in the top center, and combining different materials to achieve different artistic effects. What you see in the center image is particularly interesting. It is application of white color. It's not exactly color per se. That effect was achieved by using eggshell, because lacquer does not mix very easily with any other pigment, and certainly it's very difficult to obtain white color using material which is originally black. So the white areas are achieved by artists simply by applying a broken eggshell to the surface. And that is also a technique which is practiced in other places in Southeast Asia. In the last segment of this presentation, I will discuss very briefly the complex way of analysis that can assist in determination of the plant origin from which lacquer was harvested, and consequently narrows down the geographical location of the raw material. And why is it important? The information provides insight into at least the origin of the plant from which the lacquer was harvested, as I mentioned earlier, leading to geographical location, but also may indicate where the object was created. It may also assist in establishing an artistic workshop and dating of the object down the road. The image in the background, by the way, is a detail from a contemporary lacquer painting by Saeko. And how that analysis is carried out? So, from the forest to laboratory. This is a very, very abbreviated process, illustration of the process that is really complex. So from the left, you can see my samples in glass vials, which I collected during field trips, and some retained their off-white color, but eventually with time, they actually went through polymerization at a much slower rate if they were exposed to air. In the center is a set of samples that were prepared as films, as very small areas on glass support, and very tiny part of it, like 0.3 gram, were used in analysis. On the right, you can see an instrument which was used for analysis primarily, and that is GCMS, which is gas chromatography with mass spectroscopy, with a pyrolyzer, which I outlined as a sort of oval outline here. Pyrolyzer basically burns in a fraction of a second a sample which was placed in it in temperature around 700 Celsius. Next sent to the products of pyrolysis for analysis, which is based on separation of species by molecular weight. So that is just a principle of that analysis. It is quite complex, and we can see a very dense data which is produced by this instrument. So how the data is convoluted once it comes out from GCMS? What is shown here is actually the end result of rather lengthy process of data processing. What you see here are so-called Gestalt Graphs, which are neatly showing determination of what kind of lacquer we have in our sample. So in short, the profile which contains certain combination of chemicals is giving us an indication if that is, for example, titiol, or if that is lacquer, like an example, the upper example from the sample in Vietnam, and titiol, which is in the bottom sample illustrated by combination of catechols and alkyl benzynes. Different profiles, different amounts of those species are indicative of what we have in our sample. That is another example of which illustrates analysis using FTIR. And that usually information which we obtain from one instrument is so-called cross-reference with analysis performed by another instrument. So what you usually see here is extraction of spectra for our samples, which are confirming what we found using a different instrument. So what is in a red square is basically a set of peaks which are indicative of specific aromatic stretching, and they show Titiol in Myanmar, when in fact one other single peak in the position of 3007 wavelength number is indicative of a lacquer in the Vietnamese sample. So some of the techniques are more precise and more accurate, I would say. In either case, we do need to cross-reference the results using different instrumentation. The additives in lacquer were detected using skin electron microscope with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. So in this case, we found very interesting inclusions, and there were well-preserved fragments of rice husk in lacquer from Inle Lake. And that was an indication that lacquer was meant to be used as a caulking material, because rice husk was used as a filler to increase the bulkiness of lacquer as a material. In conclusion, examining all aspects of an artwork or artifact by tracing working methods of artists and artisans and combining that with chemical analysis, we can much better understand the context in which an object was created. So more about this work which I presented today, you can find an article which was published in 2019 titled The Chemical Analysis of Southeast Asia Lacquer, collected from forests and workshops in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar. That was published by the Journal of in the Journal of Cultural Heritage. I will welcome some questions about the content, and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you. ありがとうございました。Then, so, Paul, you have some comment right away, or you wanna open?
Usually, yes, but
okay, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead.
Well, I'm sure lots of other people have things to say too. One thing I would mention: you're all really welcome, not only to speak up, but also use the chat box for any comments, questions, and not just question and answer, but also comments on your own experiences with lacquer materials and so on. What I am so surprised at is the near disappearance of this tradition, because it was clearly far more important in the past because of the huge numbers of kinds of lacquer ware that we find in our collections and historically. So I really commend saving this. I do want to also mention, I believe Kun Supamath Snitwong is here, and she's at the Queen Circuit Institute, which is the organization that, yeah, hello, Kun Supamath.
Hello.
She is from the Queen Circuit Institute in Thailand, which is the organization that has done a lot of the royal patronage to preserve crafts, including the lacquerware. So I hope she'll speak up as well. I do think this was a very lively talk. We in the course of how to do these webinars, we were never sure, should we be doing sequential translations? You speak a little bit and then it's translated. We finally decided this system of videos is working very well. It allows for twice the amount of information as our previous efforts did. And I think this one was a really good example of the kinds of varied amount of information, and ethnographic as well as chemical and scientific. And so I really appreciate that. Well, lots more to say, but I'll just make that comment. And I urge everyone to speak up, and feel free if you'd like to turn on your screens as well.
まずもし皆さんコメントとか質問とかございましたら、マイクをオフにしてくださっても構いませんし、あとチャットに書き込んでくださっても構いません。でそれはテイラー先生の方からあったのは、例えばね、まず最初に今ちょうどカメラをオンにしてくださいましたけども、スピットンセンさんとかですね、タイの方の、美術史とかの美術史の専門家でございまして、彼女の方からもコメントとかまずあると思います。で、今回の、このセミナーシリーズ自体、実験的なことがたくさんあったんですけども、今回はですね、字幕を事前に入れてやる形で、行わせていただきました。同時通訳っていうのももちろんあったんですけども、今回の花さんの発表のように民族史的そして科学的に内容が濃いものになればしたらやっぱり同時通訳になるととても時間がかかってしまいますので、こういう感じで字幕でやれるということはうまく少しでも皆さんに情報が提供できる形でできたのかなと思ってます。はい。Alright. Yep. Let's go back to anybody. Yeah.
Let's just follow up on Dr. Taylor's comment about combination of analysis and ethnographic information. I try to stress out the importance of having the context and understanding the context of how materials are used and processed, because that gives us, those who are studying materials, really a full picture how to interpret what we see in analysis. How, for example, why, for example, I saw addition of rice husk in our samples, just because lacquer was used as caulking material. So that makes lots of sense and explains why we see what we actually see during analysis in a laboratory. So without the ethnographic context, without the context where the samples were collected or how they were used, how the material was used, it will be very difficult to understand what we actually encounter in our samples.
テイラー先生のコメントにお答えする形で述べさせていただきたいんですけども、その原さんのアプローチというのは民族史的人類学的である文系的なアプローチとテクニカル要するに技術的科学的なアプローチというのを織り交ぜてやってるんですけども、それを混ぜることによってそのマテリアル、その物質、素材が使われている全体像っていうのをなるだけ引き出せるようになるということを言われています。例えば漆がですね、コーク材みたいなその防水加工として使われている中で、それだけじゃなくてですね、米のあれですね、ぬかとか全体の、周りの方、それが要するに補強材、穴埋め材として使われているようである、使われていることっていうのは、やはり生活の中を見ていかないと、それに見ていくことによって細かくより分かるっていうところが大事なところ、その事例として挙げられると思います。はい。Right. Anybody? Oh, there's one comment here. Only comment. It's a nice. The nature of lacquer in each country and its position in industry and life in the country everywhere are very interesting. That's a comment from one Japanese participant. Yeah.
Is the quality of lacquer in Japan, of course, the mastery of working with lacquer is very, very different than in all other countries. Even though tradition is equally old, I would say, in the region, but application is different and working with lacquer is also quite different. So thank you for the comment. That's very true.
あれですよね、漆のその使い方とか、使用法とか産業っていうのが、地域によって本当異なるということ、そのことについて興味深いっていうことでコメントをいただいたんですけども、まさにその通りですね。その漆の質だけじゃなくて、その漆にまつわる技術っていうのが、日本も含めて、違う形で多様性がある っていうのはまさにその通りだと思いますということでした。はい。
I'm wondering if the range of the plant itself is related to the range of the lacquer production, because the production of lacquer sort of falls off as you move away from East and Southeast Asia. I don't know, in Indonesia, I've kind of associated it with places on Sumatra and often with Chinese communities. But you know, how widespread is the lacquer? Is it only limited to where the plant grows? I don't know.
Where lacquer comes is extracted from plants, so it is definitely associated with where the plants grow. And the only truly dedicated area for plantations of lacquer trees I found in northern Vietnam, and also in Cambodia. The French artist, he and his brother took upon themselves to plant some of the trees. Those trees are not growing that easily. So yes, the short answer would be definitely it is related to where the plants, where the trees are growing, because they somehow select their own environment in a way. They require water, they require lots of water. And that's also down the road how lacquer is sort of polymerized in high humidity. Even when artists are working with lacquer paintings, they create high humidity chambers to make those lacquers, you know, hard. So going back to the plant, absolutely, that is definitely that connection. And as I said, only 2 places which I encountered in those 3 countries was where lacquer trees were harvested for the purpose. I mean, lacquer trees were planted for the purpose of harvesting the latex. So in Thailand, that is also practiced. I didn't have a chance to explore the market in Thailand. If I stayed longer, probably would be my next place to explore. But that is also one location where where trees are being purposely planted and actually nurtured. The plantations are nurtured because that is supported by the royal family. It's one of the important crafts which is associated with the tradition of the country. So that's what I could say about Thailand, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to explore that. But it's a conference which I attended in 2015 in Bangkok was fantastic. However, those conferences do not produce really much of a printed information. It's also they don't share list of participants, which is unfortunate because we cannot fall back and make contacts with people. Those whom you grab during the conference, you can continue conversation with, but there is nothing really which is following in terms of traditional post prints from the conference. But nevertheless, the event was absolutely magnificent in one of the high-end hotels, and the royal family was partially sponsoring. So it was truly a royal experience. We had the best lunches we ever had, probably in, I don't know, ever in any place.
I would happy to help you with your next project if you come here in Thailand. It would be my pleasure.
I would love to. I would love to.
And one more question about the plantation. As you were saying, because I have no idea about this plant, and as I see the plants and I hear about the condition of the plants, is it similar to the rubber plantation of the southern part of Thailand? Could it be like planted at the same way of the rubber plantation?
No, actually, the only similarities which I would draw between rubber plantation or rubber trees and lacquer is that is latex. And latex basically is suspension of, I would say, granules or micron level and micron size granules in liquid. So that is definition of latex. However, harvesting of rubber latex is totally different because it is a continuation of very fine, cutting in very fine way, I would say, fine cuts across the bark. And lacquer, as you notice, was very differently cut through the bark. So rather crudely, I would say, exposing like it was in Myanmar, making really large incisions in Cambodia. And it's very different way of collecting because it really doesn't flow. Rubber latex flows. You can see, you can capture literally drop after drop. And that is not the same with lacquer. That's why, for example, a collection of those vessels, bamboo vessels in Vietnam was happening like once a week because they would collect literally few grams of lacquer. Is very slow going, I would say. So the only similarity is basically in definition of latex.
Can I translate?
Okay, yeah, please translate. I'm sorry.
I know. I'm like, sorry for interruption, but
No.
まず最初にですね、テイラー先生の方から質問があったのが、この漆に関わる木の裁判範囲というのと、あとこう利用範囲ですね、漆の利用範囲、地域的なものが同じなのか違うのかっていう質問でした。で、それに対しての反応、回答というのが、花さんの回答というのが、まず最初にここで、事例として挙げさせてくださったフランス人の工芸家のお話があるんですけども、工房の近くの方で植林をしたらしいんですけども、うまくいかなかったらしいんですね。ですからやはり環境的な要因っていうのが植林にはかかってる。で、特に工房で、行う場合、作業を行う場合っていうのはやはり湿度とか、いろいろ環境的なものっていう要素を入れて、それでなるだけ環境的なものを再生しようとしながら、取り組む必要がある、取り組んでるって形なので、やはりどうしても環境的要因っていうのはその使用範囲っていうのと裁判範囲っていうのが関わる意味での大きな要素であると思います。で、その中で次にタイのことについて述べてたんですけども、まずタイでは調査をされてなかったらしいんですけども、人工的な植林、プランテーションとしてこの、漆の方の森林を持ってプランテーション森林を持っている大きな地域のうちにタイがあるらしくてですね、それはやはり王室、タイ王室の方が関与しているところが側面があるらしいです。で、特に2015年に学会があったらしくですね、その学会の方のサポートを王室がしたらしくてですね、で、学会としてはいろいろ取り組まれてるらしいんですけども、特にはもう食べ物がおもてなしがとても良かったらしいです。で、そこでマスさんからのお答えなんですけども、次のプロジェクトもしタイでやる場合には協力させていただきますよってことなんですけども、プランテーションに対しての質問がありました。で、これゴムプランテーションが南タイの方になるんですけども、それと漆のプランテーションっていうのは似ているのかどうかっていう質問でした。で、漆ももちろんラテックスが取れるんですけども、もう大きな点として違うのがあれですね、抽出の仕方です。で、ラテックスをそのまま取るのと、ゴムをそのまま取ると、切り込みを入れると流れてくるらしいんですね、スピードが速くて。それに対して漆っていうのは抽出がすごいゆっくりになるので、そういう意味では確かにプランテーションとしてはあるんですけども、やっぱり運営の仕方っていうのはかなり違うらしいです。はい。Sorry, it was long. Yeah.
ちょっと質問があるんですけど、英語でいい。Thank you, Hanna, for such a great talk. It was very interesting. I have sort of a question and sort of a comment. What I was wondering about this sort of kind of disappearance or reduction in scale of lacquer production, and I've had a chance to work with some traditional lacquer workers in Japan who have been experiencing sort of similar trends. And one thing that I found was quite interesting in terms of my ethnographic research, and I don't know if your ethnographic side of your research, you encountered this as well, was the kind of interdependence between lacquer workers and other kinds of artisans. So oftentimes cabinet makers or sculptors or people making other kinds of crafts will bring their works to lacquer specialists who then finish the products basically and lacquer the cabinets or whatever. And so as other types of crafts have become maybe less popular or trendy, or they are decreasing in production, so too the lacquer workers are finding less work to do, because often they aren't the ones who both make the kind of product or sculpt the wood or carve it and then also lacquer. They tend to be lacquer specialists. So that's one of the challenges facing Japanese traditional lacquer workers. I was just wondering if you found that to be the case in the countries you were working in as well. And I did happen to notice that someone asked a question here similarly: why is lacquer art disappearing, in the chat box? So that's a related question. Maybe you could address that one too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent point. You're absolutely right. There is definitely an interdependence of different, I would say, part of production. I can only speak about two places, which is one in Myanmar. You remember seeing the sisters in front of our group offering plate, which was for basically exemplified number of offering plates or trays for temples. So usually there is somebody who is creating those different structures, and lacquer is applied by those ladies who are running the workshop. So that's definitely division of function, I would say. Also, however, in Cambodia, the artist did everything himself, really. He was also plating all the containers. He created sculptures. He was an artist himself. But that is an exception. In Vietnam, what I observed, I primarily visited artistic workshops. I visit artists and I interviewed them. So what was interesting is that it takes incredibly long time to prepare supports for lacquer paintings. They have to be perfect. So they have a specialized, I would say, workshop in itself who is dedicated to making those supports for a whole group of artists. So that person or that workshop of 3 or 4 people is doing just that, supports on which artists are creating their paintings. They have to polish, they have to dry, they have to put additives to it. And in fact, in one of the places I found addition of clay, which was from the river running through Hanoi. So that was very interesting to find that filler in support, which was created for artwork. So definitely there is interdependence. I was focused on techniques of harvesting because, as I mentioned, the way tools are created, the way lacquer, for example, is mixed, that also has impact on coloration. And that I learned from an artist, the Japanese artist who works in Vietnam, in Hoi An. She said, for example, that mixing lacquer with iron rod makes lacquer darker because metal goes into reaction with latex. So that is, we have alarm, by the way, sorry, alarm of flooding. So you can hear right now in my alarm system. But anyway, yes, so definitely there is independence. However, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my response, Myanmar, making traces for temples was just only one part of their activities. They also were preparing lacquer for caulking or filling, gaps in boats. So that was also very utilitarian. I think in general, looking at the quality of lacquer work in Japan and even China, the quality is much, sorry, this is my alarm again.
Hope it's fine over there though.
It doesn't stop.
Yeah, it's a civil
It's alarm of flooding because we have right now a storm here. But anyway, I cannot stop that. That's the purpose of that alarm. Anyway, yes, so quality of lacquer work.
Translate also.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Hannah. Go ahead, Hannah, please.
Yes, you can actually translate, but basically that's the concept of it, yes.
あとロバさんの方からの質問があったと、もう一つフロアの方からも質問をくださったんですけども、Why is the lacquer art disappearing in Southeast Asia? Like start to hear. 日本でもあれですね、漆工芸の方の減少についてロバさんが調査したら、日本の職人の方たちと話したときに、やはり相互依存関係、相互関係のことについての話になったらしいです。例えば漆職人だけじゃなくて、漆と木工職人の協力関係とか業務の連携関係、そしてその中でいろいろ複数要因の中で減ってきて、もう苦労されてる話があったらしいんですけれども、その東南アジア、花さんの方の調査のお話からをしていただきます。例えばミャンマーなんかはですね、宗教施設、仏教系のお寺とかでのもうかなり機能的に完全に分化して特化した形になって、その方で支援を受けながら行われているものとか、すみません、カンボジアのところを聞き逃してしまったんですけども、次ベトナムの場合ですと、そのアーティストとか芸術家の方がもう工房で関わっている人全員にもう支援をする形で回していく、そんな形で依存関係で継続していったりをすると。あともう一つ大事なところっていうのが、どのようにしてこの工具とか道具とか材料が使われているのかっていうのも要因として与えられてくることなんじゃないか。例えばこの今回の発表で使われた日本人芸術家の漆作品ですね。方のように、例えばどのように漆と他の鉄とか金とかを組み合わせているか。あと例えば船の、防水剤のように、例えば実務的なところでどのようにまだ使われているのか、そういうものっていうのが混ざりながら見ていくことができるんじゃないかということでした。はい。すみません。次。Yuji, you have a question? I think.
じゃあいいですか、私から。
はい。
じゃあ山田先生、ちょっと翻訳していただいてもよろしいですか。
わかりました。
すいません。はい。ちょっと私、私、実は漆製のコーヒーマグカップを使ってます。
That's a lacquer coffee mug cup.
はい。はい。で、ちょっと紹介、ちょっと見えないかもしれないんですけど、ちょっと見えないかな。日本の、柴田是真という、職人がいて、1870年代から1880年代にラッカーペインティングっていうのを得意とした職人がいて、これ漆なんですけど、木目調に見えるんですけど、木っぽく作ってるっていうね、木のフェイクで漆を描いてるっていう漆絵なんですね。こういったものを作ったりとか、あとはそうですね。結構先ほど貝の話がとかエッグの話が出てきたんですけど、例えば漆絵、これも漆絵なんですけど、わかりますかね。これも漆絵、これもラッカーペインティングなんですけど、岩の部分が漆で、あと青貝っていう貝をちょっと混ぜたりしてるんですね。ちょっと小さくて見えないんですけど、青貝っていうの貝を入れたりとか、そういった漆絵って作ったんですけど、ただなかなかこの漆絵のこのジャンルって1870年代、80年代で柴田自身が開発したんですけど、なかなか継承されずに、そんなにメジャーにはならなかったっていうのはあります。かなりのテクニックが必要っていうのはありますし、相当難しいっていうのもあったので、なかなか漆絵っていうのがうまく普及しなかったんじゃないかなっていうふうに思いますね。すみません、山田先生、お願いします。
What usually is showing is that it's the painting, the lacquer painting of Zeshin Shibata, the artist like was active between like 1870s and 80s in Japan. So he's a lacquer artist, and the first the art that he's showing right now on the screen is a kind of wooden imitation design, but it's a lacquer art. So that which kind of look like a wood, but it's just a lacquer. The second one he showed was it's the painting of rock and shellfish. So that the dark part is both use of lacquer. So the red one is both lacquer, and the darker part is lacquer. But what he said was like after him, this lacquer art, the urushi, this style didn't come to the mainstream because he thinks that it's possible it's because of the really complicated technique, which kind of didn't probably go translate or hand over to the next the current generations.
Yes, making art and using lacquer is very complicated. I only very briefly mentioned it is sort of reduction type of art, meaning, creating of a painting, because you remove layer rather than add layers. So you have to have a concept of your design when you apply layer upon layer, and then you basically remove it to reveal what is underneath. It's very complicated. And to create a very precise shape of design, it is quite an achievement. So I totally agree with that, and it's not an easy task. That is also one of the probably reasons why the whole art using lacquer is declining. Not just only harvesting, which requires walking through water often, as I showed you in Cambodia, climbing the trees in most cases, but just also working as a technique, as a material, working lacquer. I would like to address one question, which was about using eggshell. A person, Louis Court, asked about using eggshell. I cannot attest to the origin of using eggshell. The question was that was introduced from Vietnam. I can only say that that technique was used in all countries which I visited, those few countries, and definitely in those three which I presented today. And it is commonly used across the board because lacquer doesn't mix with any other color really besides cinnabar. That's why we have lacquer in red, and we have lacquer which is black, naturally black, which is going through polymerization. Additions of green and yellow, which you had a chance to see in carving in Myanmar, was because it was added later into carving, not as part of the lacquer layer per se. So that white is commonly used, basically crushing eggshell or duck eggshell. So to create that white impression of a white color. So it has very specific also type of ornamentation. You can see those black lines in between islands of white. But I cannot say for sure that came from Vietnam or from Myanmar. And definitely the one which I showed from in Cambodia, I stress that this is a French artist who is embracing traditions through the whole region. So he cannot be representative of really Cambodian style by any stretch of imagination. He's working, he's maintaining the tradition, and he's the only one whom I know in Cambodia who is working with lacquer. Maybe there's one more person, but we never figure out who that person is because he's not known or doesn't really advertise in any way his work. So I hope that answers the question.
まず最初にですね、田中先生のコメントに対する答えなんですけども、やはりこの漆絵はとても複雑な技術が必要で、普通だったらば普通の、一般的な絵画であれば色を上に足していくんですけども、漆絵の場合は そう複数の層の色をを準備して、それを剥いでいく、研いでいくっていうのが技術なので、その形、デザインっていうのも本当に前もって把握していかないといけない。そうなってくると技術的に難しいというのと、あともう一つはそれと同時にお話しさせていただいたように、その植林とか木の栽培もとても大変と、環境的なもので、美術の方も大変で、このもう複雑な要素がたくさん絡んでると思います。でもう一つの方はルイス・コーツさんの方からの質問だったんですけども、特に卵の殻を現代技術の方で使われているカンボジアの話を述べてたんですけども、そのことに対する質問なんですけども、これは要するにこのようなことはベトナムから来たのか、それともどこから来たのでしょうかということだったんですけども、実際にどこから来たかっていうのは、ちょっとおそらくそこまでは突っ込めないところみたいです。一応今回は花さんの調査の中でカンボジアでの事例っていうのを見ましたけども、もしかすると他のところにもあるかもしれませんし、で色をねうまく黒と色を表現する中での装飾で卵の殻を使ってますけども、そう必ずしもカンボジアだけじゃなくてこの地域、他の地域でも同様のことがやられている可能性はあります。はい。Other questions?
I wanted to make one more comment.
Okay.
Robert? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to point out something that the viewers here may not know, and that Hannah, you mentioned briefly that working with lacquer can give you an allergic reaction, for example, working with the raw materials. And that indeed is very true. In fact, it's quite a poisonous substance, and we can liken it sort of here in North America maybe to poison ivy or something. Like you can develop a pretty bad rash. And not only that, the fumes that are emitted from it are, well, first they don't smell good, but also they can be quite dangerous to over time if you have repeated exposure to that. Yeah, so that may be another impediment or difficulty, for people that want to work with lacquer or interested in it as a possible hobby or even a career or something, and they want to get into working with lacquer. So I just wanted to point that out, and I don't know if you had any difficulties when you were doing your research, actually working with samples and that kind of thing.
Fortunately, I was not affected at all, but I also did not really touch with my fingers. I work with gloves, and I work with small amounts, and I basically handled in containers. But what somebody actually mentioned when I worked in the field, that people who plan to work with lacquer, they actually consume small amounts of lacquer from childhood almost, just to protect themselves, to somehow immune in a way their body against allergies. And I did not see any allergies among women, those sisters who work with lacquer directly. They really didn't pay any attention to precautions as we do, wearing gloves. They basically very freely worked with it. So I think eventually somebody can build up somehow resistance to resilience towards lacquer or being affected by lacquer. Fortunately, I had absolutely no negative experience working with lacquer. So
I'm happy to hear that. And yeah, I can agree with that, with the shokunin, the Japanese craftsmen I worked with, that worked with lacquer. Indeed, they have bare hands, working with the lacquer in small rooms and no problems, but before I knew about this problem, I reached out to touch a bucket of the lacquer that he had presented, to show me, and he no, he says, dame. He said, don't touch that. But I didn't know because he wasn't wearing gloves. So indeed, you can build up, I guess, a resistance over time, and this is what he told me as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
ロバートさんの方からの質問っていうのは、漆っていうものが毒性を持ってて、アレルギーを引き起こすことがあるっていうことが発表に今日あったんですけども、例えば繰り返しですね、例えば吸引すると危険だったり、することがあると思います。で、その中で花さんの方にその調査をされているときにそのような問題に直面したことは あったんですかっていうことだったんですけど、まあ幸いにはそういうことはなかったらしいんですけども、プランテーションとか森林の方で抽出作業をしている人たちのところで見かけられたのが、その漆っていうのをある意味こうドライフード、乾燥食としてこう食べてたりしてる人がいるってことなんですね。でそれによってこう免疫がつくのかもしれないのかなということで、あともう一つは要するにああいうて作業されている人たちのが素手で作業されていると。でアレルギーがこう比較されてないので、ある程度こう免疫をつける効果があるのかどうなんじゃないかっていう話をされてます。で特にそこに対してこうロバートさんの返答っていうのが、その日本の職人の方と、こう調査訪問したときに、もう素手で特に小さい工房の中で作業されてても、こうアレルギー反応がこう出てなくて、でそれに対してこうロバートさんが素手でこう持とうとしたら、もちろんもうちゃんとこう危ない危ないって言ってこう止められたことがあったということでした。はい。いかがでしょうか。I guess it's already 11:20, 20 already. Wow, so quick. Yeah, any more questions or comments?
May I just ask if your experience in the analysis of material science has given you any insight to the conservation issues for museum collections with lacquer, which have big problems, as you know, for us. I mean, we're so beautiful in our collections, but they seem to need a particularly uniquely high humidity for long-term storage compared to many. Certainly, most of our storerooms don't have this level of humidity, and it would be the wrong humidity for all the other stuff that we have in our collections. So a lot of people ignore this. And the other interesting thing about lacquer, when it cracks, which it does when it gets dry, you know, we have conflicting policies. In general, museums like to say that everything should be conserved in a way that causes no damage. And also you can tell the difference between what's been added and what's original. So that's one procedure that you could try to follow to fill in the cracks. But traditionally, I understand that in Japan, to fill in the crack, you cut away a portion on both sides and fill it in. I don't know if this is true, but I have heard this. Which would be in violation of other principles. But we also have this principle that says, you know, sometimes you should follow whatever is locally, culturally appropriate. I don't know, do you want to translate before we?
So what I mean, I just want to double check. So in Japan, they want to cut?
I understood, although I have heard this, and I don't know if it's true, that when you have a crack in a lacquer, that people traditionally repair it will cut. If it's then you cut away a space so that you remove some of the original lacquer and fill in the space with a better fill. Is that true? And if so, that's of course a policy issue.
その博物館の保存収蔵の視点からの話ですと、この漆工芸っていうのはとてもまたややこしいもので、その湿度の保管っていうのが求められるんですけども、その湿度っていうのが他の収蔵品にとっては理想的じゃないっていうのが悩ましいところなんです。で特に博物館の収蔵物になるとダメージを受けた時っていうのは要するにその状況を回復するように修復をすることが求められるんですけども、漆工芸でひびが入るとその修復ですね、のことについて悩ましいところで、日本はそのもう修復っていうんじゃなくてわざと割ってまた直すっていうことを耳にしたらしいんですけども、田中先生このあたりっていうのは確かですか？
すみません。はい。
で、漆の工芸の、
Yeah, maybe you can say. Yeah.
はい。で、漆について言うと、博物館の中でやはり漆のレラティブヒューミディティっていうのは高めに設定しなくちゃいけないので、漆専用の収蔵庫っていうのを設けてます。だから他のオブジェクトとは違う保管庫に、保管してます。はい。まず1点これトランスレートしていただいていいですか？
はいはい。 The first thing that I'm going to respond to your comment about the preservation first in the museum is that in Japanese museums cases, they have their designated storage for lacquerwares.
Yeah,
that's
what we
the
need.
first response. Then the second one.
そうそう。で、2つ目、やはり修復の時はやっぱ現状保存が原則ですので、やはりこう、クラックでひび割れたところをこう剥がしてっていうよりは、それを現状のなるべく残して、で、漆で補細、補足するっていう形が原則だと思います。
So what he said is like in terms of the usual restoration policy is the same as other museum holdings. So instead of like completely cutting and damage, they try to do that to minimize the new try to completely restore and they use the lacquer paint to kind of repair the damage. So it's not like a kind of like add more damage to make it like yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yes, I'm not really sure how that is actually done, but I can, based on that explanation, I can visualize that basically that cutting is to remove areas which cannot be reset or relaxed and basically use lacquer to fill in the loss. That could be the reason. And I think there's also a slightly different approach to preservation in general in Asia. I only say so because, for example, rebuilding temples is also considered preservation. Rebuilding temples periodically according to old tradition, even though materials are replaced, it's also considered a preservation practice. So drawing that parallel, I would say removal of certain parts and fill in with new lacquer would fit into the same philosophy. So as you mentioned, we do follow regional approach to preservation, which may differ from Western type of, let's say, principles. So I would not be surprised that cutting would be also one of those procedures. Imagine that you have a lacquer which is behaving better, which has better in a way prepared such a way that it was going to hold the damaged area. And I can tell you, I brought with me one vessel from Vietnam. It's completely cracked, the whole surface. I didn't realize how it would be affected in our environment, in our humidity. It's totally cracked, the whole lacquer under the vessel. So it was such a beautiful piece from the 40s, which was given to me as a present. And unfortunately, I could not provide really a special humidity chamber, but that's what happened to one of my objects which I brought with me from Asia. So.
そうですね。今花さんの回答というかコメントとしてあったのが、おそらくもう一つあるのが、そのアジア圏であるその修復の概念のもしかして違いっていうのもあるかもしれませんということでした。っていうのは例えばお寺とか建築物であるように、例えばその部分修復の部分とか木造建築なんかでもそうですけども、こう違ったパーツに要するに取り替えることっていうのが修復として木造建築なんかでは見られますけども、それはある意味西洋的な修復概念からしてはちょっと違うと。で、おそらくそれと類似するところがあるのではないかと。ですからわざわざあるものを取るところっていうのを修復っていうふうな概念として取るか、それじゃなくて修復ってしか取らないのかと。おそらくそれを修復として取ると、おそらくこの漆工芸の方のやつの修復方法っていうのも、もしかすると西洋的な概念からはダメージを加えているように見えるのではないのかということだったんですけど、いかがでしょうか。田中先生。
はい。で、そうですね。おそらく 直すっていうところがね、日本の木造建築とかだともう本当に部材ごともう取り替えてしまうっていうね、そこでもうそれが取り替わって、しかも日本の法隆寺とかもそうですけど、完全にもう部材ってもう当時の部材じゃないわけですよね。それが全部取り替わってしまって、で、それでもう本当に塗り直すっていうところもあるかもしれないんですけど、その博物館の資料とそのお寺の建築の漆とは、またその、おそらくその修復の概念っていうのが違ってくるんでしょうね。うん。あともう一つ、これはまた別の話題になってしまうんですけど、よくアメリカとかヨーロッパから作品を借りるときに、アメリカとかヨーロッパの方が乾燥してるじゃないですか。で、日本って高温多湿で湿度が高くて、そうするとアメリカとかヨーロッパから借りるときの湿度の設定と、日本のミュージアムの湿度の設定にこう差があるってことがよくあるんですよね。その時って漆にとってはあまり良くないコンディションなので、その辺のすり合わせっていうのがかなり必要になってくるんですけど、アメリカの基準と日本の基準がこう漆でちょっと違ったりするとちょっと難しいなっていうのがありますね。実際問題。はい。
The one other thing here, Yuji's response was like, yes, it's in terms of that architectural restoration in Japan and Asia, there are usually they kind of completely replace some of the section, the segment of the building, then that is considered to be restoration. But it's come to museum collection and holdings. They have still much probably a different restoration expectation and standard. It's kind of probably closer to the Western sense. So might apply that the concept might not apply in some way. One additional aspect, one thing, another comment he made is interesting is comparing to like a US and Europe, where it's much drier than Japan, and Japan is much, the humider and wet here. So when they museums or the collections goes to US and Europe in much drier regions, sometimes setting up that the humidity standard, if there's already institutional standard about humidity to the museum, the storage at the collections, then it can become a causal trouble about the preservation or the management.
Changing for a moment subject, somebody asked about.
Go ahead. Waterproofing.
Somebody asked about the application of lacquer to baskets. That was a very good comment, and I did mention briefly only. And yes, that is form of waterproofing. And I saw actually that was in Myanmar, people going to the market with large baskets which were completely coated, especially interior, with lacquer, just to make sure that nothing is going to leak through, to fill in all the spaces in between weaving. So definitely it is used on baskets in all the places as just utilitarian purpose.
質問の方であったのは、例えばカゴとかに使われている漆の塗装なんですけども、これはある意味あれですか、防水機能とかのこともあるのかどうかってことなんですけど、まさにそうで、大体内側に漆がカゴで塗られていて、東南アジアの方のものが漏れた時とかに、保護されたり、漏れない形で。塗装が施されていたりするみたいです。まさにその通りみたいです。Okay, I think it's already 11:35. Yeah. So I guess that somehow the Paul probably lost the connection. The Paul さんがね、今ちょっとおそらくネットワークがおかしくなっちゃって、抜けてしまっちゃってるんですけども、もうちょっと1時間半超えてしまったので、ちょっとこのあたりで一旦区切りたいと思います。Hanna, do you want to share your contact information for the participant today? Like if they want to have a follow-up information?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, in the chat box.
I'm going to, my email address to everybody.
そうですね、今日もおそらくこのままどんどん続けていくこともできると思うんですけども、もう1時間半経ってしまったので、ちょっとここで一旦切りたいと思います。そこでですね、花さんのこの E メールアドレスをここに載せてくださいましたので、チャットの方にありますので、今後もし追ってコメントとかご質問とか直接話したいという時があったら、ぜひこちらの方に連絡を送ってみてください。She just shared her email address in the chat box, so if there's more follow-up question, follow-up discussion, you want to have much questions, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and I do appreciate everybody's questions, and I definitely look forward to continue conversation with anyone who is interested. It's always a fascinating subject, so I very much welcome your comments, and thank you for participation.
本当今日はありがとうございました。もう続けてね、皆さんとのコメントとか、やり取り、そして議論をしていくことっていうのは本当に助かっておりますので、これからも、もし続けてできればと思ってます。そしてちょっと一旦ここで録画を取りましょう。Stop the recording.